Hello, everyone. I'm Chris, and this is Victoria. The topic for our virtual coffee break is on education, and we're going to talk about the perceived disadvantages and how it can be turned into an advantage during a pandemic like COVID-19. So perhaps Victoria here will discuss first the apparent disadvantages of a pandemic.
Hello. So I'll talk about the perceived disadvantages because of the pandemic, where in different countries there's this shelter in place or no face-to-face interaction between teachers and students. So we could talk about people thinking that no classroom lectures would hinder student learning. There's also the perception that online learning makes it difficult to track inattentive and unengaged students, meaning they might be doing something else even if the teacher has the impression that the students are working at their computers. And then, of course, the question is, would superior learning outcomes not be possible with no internet connectivity? And this holds true for many countries where there is no widespread internet connectivity for their people. And there's also the perceived disadvantage that parents would be forced to guide their children in their lessons, and this becomes especially problematic when you have advanced topics to be taken up by their children. Now, the disadvantage of no face-to-face interaction can be turned into an advantage if we use process-induced learning in contrast to teacher-induced learning. So it is our thesis that the disadvantages can be turned into an advantage by working on independent learning. Because if you have a good program, this would effectively transform students into independent learners, which would be good for the fourth industrial revolution. Then we could also accommodate new results from neuroscience to improve learning. We could also bypass the worldwide lack of mature science, technology, engineering, and math teachers, as well as bypass the lack of internet connectivity in many households in different countries in the world. And of course, we could also have a program which could enable nations with limited educational budgets to catch up with performance levels of the richer nations. Now, we think that this can all be done through what we call as the CVIF. CVIF is for the Central Visayan Institute Foundation, the name of our school, and the Dynamic Learning Program, which we call the DLP. So Chris will be the one to talk about the DLP.
Yes. So the Dynamic Learning Program, or DLP for short, was started in 2002, and it's a systems approach to process-induced learning in contrast to teacher-induced learning. And the program incorporates 21st century skills like critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, communication, which are very important skills for the next generation. And this program, for the past 18 years, has been applied at the elementary, high school, and college levels. So what is this program all about? The CVIF DLP for Dynamic Learning Program, targets learner disposition. And it targets learner disposition with four crucial components. One is the parallel learning homes, and this is more or less automatic during a pandemic, and it automatically limits teacher intervention to 0 to 20%. The next component is the activity-based learning by doing, where the students will be doing a lot of writing, and they will be using an LAS. LAS is for Learning Activity Sheet. And there's no introductory lecture when they do that. The third component is an in-house comprehensive portfolio where they file everything. And the fourth one is strategic rest. That means there's nothing beyond the LAS. So let's start with the first component, which is the parallel learning homes. So you can imagine having an LAS for each student, and they will be working on this independently without teacher intervention. And there's no need for parents to tutor them. That's the very design of the learning activity sheets or the LAS. Then once a week, they will be collected so that the subject teacher will be able to assess them and evaluate them. And every week, they will receive a new batch of learning activity sheets. Now, what is this learning activity sheet? What's the basic design? Well, it's quite simple. It starts for any topic from grade 7 to 12 or even college. It starts with a short concept digest followed by an example and then an illustration. And then it ends with 2 or 3 questions which would tie up the topic. And there will be a series of these LAS or learning activity sheets. And this step-by-step series will lead to an more elaborate concept. So this series of LAS is based on the fact that any complex task can be divided into simpler steps. It could be divided into 10 steps, and even a single step could be further subdivided so that even the challenged learners would be able to accomplish it. Maybe let's have an example of what an LAS looks like. Let's choose calculus, for example, which is given to our grade 11 class. So our example of a learning activity, this would actually fit into one long page, but for our purposes, it will be split into 2 pages in the PowerPoint. So the activity title would be the geometric interpretation of the integral. This is about integral calculus. And the learning target is to interpret an integral as the limit of a sum of areas. We won't go through in detail in this particular learning activity, but just the basic fundamental concept. So for example, we have 3 examples actually. The first example is if you're asked what would be the area of this polygon, this 6-sided polygon, well, one strategy, one way is to cover the whole polygon by 6 triangles. Everybody knows how to get the area of a triangle. So in this case, just get the area of one triangle, multiply by 6, and then you will have the area of the polygon. Our second example is a bit more complicated. Suppose we're being asked how to get the area of the blue shaded area under the red arrow. Again, we can make use of familiar geometrical objects to calculate the area of under the red arrow. And we could cover this area by a triangle and a rectangle. So just by calculating the area of the triangle and the area of this rectangle, then we can already obtain the area under this red arrow. And the third example where really calculus would come in is the following. Suppose you're being asked what would be the area under the red curve bounded by these segments from A to B. Again, we use the same trick. We use familiar geometrical objects. And we can cover this area by, let's start with 3 rectangles. With each rectangle has the height M1. This rectangle would be M2 and then M3. And the width would be delta X1, delta X2, and delta X3. So the area of this one rectangle is just the height times the width, or its height times the width, and then for the second rectangle, and then for the third rectangle, and then you can get the area, more or less an approximation of the area under the red curve. And it can be denoted by this summation, which later on will become an integral symbol. And then we end with the question, how can we improve our approximation for the area under the curve? Of course, for those who know calculus, the idea really is to increase the number of rectangles from 100 to 1000 or even infinite number of rectangles. Then you will have a better approximation of the area under the red curve. And that's essentially the fundamental concept in integral calculus. So this is an example of a LAS, of a learning activity sheet. Yes, please.
Maybe I would just like to emphasize that the students in the CVIF Dynamic Learning Program, the students accomplish this learning activity without any introductory lecture. So it should be a one-page activity. They simply go through the instructions and read and try to answer the question, and then there will be a next activity that they will do.
So again, there will be activities before this one and after this one, and they will be eased up into a more complex idea. So in the CVIF DLP, we often say that an ideal learning activity is an activity where zero or no teacher intervention is necessary. That's why it's immune to lockdowns, because lockdown simply means that the teacher cannot lecture. And it's a rule in the DLP that an introductory lecture, there should be no prior lectures, so that the students will read it, they will develop critical thinking, comprehension, and problem-solving abilities crucial for the 21st century. Now, a very important component of the CVIF DLP is to copy by hand all the learning activities. And this is making use of some of the neuroscientific results, and there are quite a number. For example, we will only mention one here, a paper which appeared in Psychological Science by Mueller and Oppenheimer. They said that note-taking with a pen rather than a laptop gives students a better grasp of the subject. And this study was done for 300 students at Princeton and the University of California, Los Angeles. And in this paper, Mueller and Oppenheimer demonstrated that students who write out their notes on paper actually learn more. In each study, those who wrote out their notes by hand had a stronger conceptual understanding and were more successful in applying and integrating the material than those who took notes with their laptops. So this note-taking, this copying by hand, is naturally incorporated in the CVIF DLP. Another study much earlier, is that writing the activities, it activates both the psychomotor and visual faculties of the brain. And Professor Hebb, long time ago, said that neurons that fire together are wired together, and neurons that fire out of sync lose their link. And all the activities that are done by the students are compiled in a comprehensive student portfolio. This can be color-coded, like yellow for science, white for math, blue for English, and so on and so forth. And it teaches them the skill of organization, which is also important for the next generation in this fourth industrial revolution. Now, this whole combination of LAS, writing LAS, and minimal teacher intervention can be scaled up. So, for example, in 2008, the Philippines lacked physics teachers, so we had a project, Learning Physics as One Nation, and it's just a combination of 239 LAS and together with 20 DVD lectures, which are closely tied with the LAS. And so we conducted this, and the result was quite successful. Now, another performance indicator in our school is the following. We have yearly a national exam called NSAT or NCAE, and 2001 was before the implementation of the CVIF DLP. And if the vertical line would be the number of students, the horizontal would be the scores, the highest score on the right. Before DLP, majority of our students were performing really badly in a sense. And then we implemented the CVIF DLP in 2002. And by 2006, we had something like this. It's almost like a splitting of the bright ones and the challenged learners. But then when you look at 2009, the figure in 2009 is almost like the reverse of 2001. So more students were learning. And by 2010, we were happy because this graph was truncated. Nobody scored below average. Even if our students, we have a very liberal admission of students, we accept almost everybody. So this is another performance indicator for the CVIF DLP. Another performance indicator would be our alumni, how they perform after they leave our school. So Ronald Duran, for example, is enrolled at ETH Zurich in marine science, which is actually #1 in the world. Another student is Madeline Naiga. She's doing her PhD in physics in a joint program between Max Planck Institute and the University of Dresden. And another one of our alumni is Jesha Caseñas, who got her BS Anthropology degree from University of California, Berkeley. There are others, but at least we could mention these three. So maybe Victoria can talk about this.
I would also like to add that our school is almost like a mission school. In the Philippines, we have both public or state schools and which offer free education, elementary and secondary education. And we have private schools. Our school is a small private school, but it's a mission school. So we serve students who come, many of whom come from economically disadvantaged families. So now, during the pandemic, when we have different conditions, how do we distribute the learning activity sheets? Then obviously, for those with internet connectivity, submission and collection will be online. However, in our school, our place is in Hagna, Bohol. It's an island in the southern part of the Philippines, and less than 30% of our junior high school students have access to the internet. So what we do is we have designated drop-off stations for our learning activity sheets where we also collect whatever they accomplish. So this would be in town centers, in village halls, where there is good air movement so that we don't have enclosed areas. And it would be the parents who would be collecting and submitting the activities of their children. It is not really the students during the quarantine conditions. And we also would like to emphasize that students can actually communicate with their friends, with their classmates by phone, by internet, or yes, by telephone also, because we would like to foster the development of collaboration, communication to achieve well-defined goals and not just social chatting or whatever. And we have always been asked during a pandemic, what is the guarantee that each student is learning? And of course, we cannot say that it's 100% guarantee, but we do know that because they copy and answer the learning activity sheet questions and exercises in their own handwriting, thus this activity would involve the psychomotor, visual, and when read aloud, the hearing faculties of the brain. So in this whole holistic approach, then we have some guarantee that the students will be learning something. And remember that these learning activity sheets will be submitted weekly and therefore assessed by the students or monitored by the teachers weekly. And also with the CVIF DLPS distance learning, how are learning outcomes assessed aside from tests? Then of course the assessment will be through the weekly learning activity sheets that are submitted, accomplished and submitted by the students. The tests will also be modified in a way to accommodate the different quarantine conditions in the small towns and villages from where our students come. And so in the pandemic scenario, in the CVIF DLP, the key element, the key ingredient would really be the learning activity sheets, for which, typical of our DLP, our dynamic learning program, there is no introductory lecture, there is zero to minimal teacher intervention, and parent tutoring is not necessary, and there is weekly assessment. This is compared to the conventional method. There are, of course, thousands of modules out there and video lectures, but normally, or at least commonly, these modules would still require a heavy or intensive teacher intervention and discussion. And this can be done, of course, online, but in countries like ours, where only a small percentage would have access to internet connectivity, this becomes less viable. And so just to summarize again the key points, the CVIF Dynamic Learning Program addresses learner disposition. So this is done through habit-forming daily protocols where students are engaged and it addresses the absence of teachers or limited teacher intervention because learning activities are done independently by the students 80 to 100% of the time, and therefore this bypasses limited face-to-face learning and expensive internet connectivity. And so we have the outstanding questions during a pandemic and our answers with the CVIF DLP. Can students learn well when there is a shelter-in-place advisory to slow down the spread of infection? And our answer is yes. Can superior learning outcomes still be achieved in different subjects, including math and science, even with no internet connectivity? And we say yes. Is it necessary for parents to guide their children in their lessons? How about for advanced topics? And we say no. The parent intervention or tutoring is not necessary because the students will have to be doing independent work so far as possible, and the assessment by the teachers will be done weekly. All the students have to do is, if they really have serious questions, they can write to the teachers on the activity sheets. Can we bypass the worldwide lack of mature and qualified STEM teachers in basic education? And we say yes. Are we taking advantage of new results from neuroscience to improve education? Yes. An example of this would be the writing by hand feature. No matter if students complain that it's tiring and it's backward, we say no. We have results to validate that, the effectivity of that feature. And finally, is there a low-cost educational program that would allow poorer nations to catch up with budget-intensive educational systems of richer nations? And we say yes. And for the final slide, I would ask Chris.
Before we end, we'd like to thank the Science Corps, our new partners, because they have been helping us develop these learning activity sheets. For example, we can start with Benjamin Rubin, who's now a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley. The same with Dr. Hyunjin Shim, also a postdoc at the University of Berkeley, and Dr. Victor Soho, who did his postdoc at the Ludwig Maximilian Universität in Munich, and Dr. Hyun Dog Shin, who finished his PhD at MIT in the USA. And for further information, we have the following websites, and we also want to thank the Smart Communications, who have been with us in this travel for many, many years. Thank you very much.